Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this climate conversation with esteemed journalist David Roberts. It's great to see so many familiar faces here today. And welcome to any of you joining us from outside of the Terra.do community. It's great to see you as well. My name is Greg Findley, and I am one of the course directors alongside Hannah Welsh, who's also with us here, in the course, the Climate Change Learning for Action course, which is Terra.do's 12-week flagship course. This talk today is the keynote for the fellows in our newly launched Xerus cohort, and it is also one of the expert guest talks for our soon-to-graduate fellows in the whale sharks cohort. These two cohorts together represent more than 200 fellows from over 25 countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. The Learning for Action course is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, and climate solutions, and it is a combination of written classes, live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, expert guest talks like this one, and workshops. Terra.do has an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. To achieve this, we offer a combination of climate education, connections to employers and jobs, and a supportive community of people who want to make a difference on climate change. You can check out our programs at Terra.do on the web, and you can find our app, which is available on the Apple App Store and on Google Play. We do offer a new cohort of Learning for Action starting every 6 weeks, and we urge you to check it out if you want to learn more about how you can become involved in addressing climate change. Before we get started, I want to go over a few nuts and bolts of this talk today. Following David's talk, we will have time for questions and answers. We are keeping the questions available to our current fellows using another platform. So we won't be using the chat feature for the questions today. So we'll prioritize questions from our current fellows. And if we have any time, we can turn to the chat at that time. To get us going, without further ado, I would like to start by introducing Terra's co-founder and Chief Learning Officer, Dr. Kamal Kapadia. Thank you, Kamal. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Greg. I am both delighted and honored to introduce David Roberts and to welcome him to our Terra community. It's safe to say that David is one of the, if not the most effective and influential clean energy and climate writers in the US. If you search for his formal bio, and I'm going to just post it in the chat right now, it's remarkably understated for what he's achieved and for the ways in which he continues to clarify and shape our understanding of clean energy and climate policy and politics. I am now going to do a formal introduction because what I want to really use this introduction for is to talk about the ways in which David Roberts is a climate hero to me. I know David chiefly through his Twitter feed and his various writings. I've been following him for a while. I'm one of his 197,000 odd followers on Twitter. And if you do not follow him, you definitely should. And for those of you in our Learning for Action program, you will see links out to his podcasts and writings amongst our various sources. I would like to highlight 3 things that really stand out to me about David and his work. First, David's capacity to demystify jargony, nerdy, technical stuff is unmatched. He has single-handedly done more to make clean energy legible to normal people in the US than anyone else I can think of. Take, for example, the topic of a recent podcast. The title is Making Sure Electric Vehicles Help Rather Than Hurt Electricity Grids. And he's interviewing 2 people from the company Grid for this. How's that for a nerdy topic? Yet David always manages to not only help you and me make sense of this, but he also helps us understand why we should care, why this matters to the climate fight. Literally every single one of his articles and podcasts exemplifies this model, demystify and explain why it matters. You can't help but be made smarter when you listen to his podcasts. Second, he's also an exceptional political observer, analyst, and commentator. But instead of pontificating from on high, David uses his Twitter feed to give voice to our collective anxiety and existential dread that we all feel about the direction of American politics. He rants. He tells us he's afraid. He uses the F word a lot. And he backs it all up with data and evidence. And in doing so, he allows us all to know that the dread we feel too is not misplaced. It's not overwrought. Unlike virtually most of the other clean energy wonky types I follow on Twitter, David sees most keenly how American politics and American democracy is fundamental to our climate fight. Finally, you know that David, for all his grumpiness on Twitter, is a deeply kind and caring human being. The way in which this really shines through is when he's talking about his 2 boys on Twitter. You've never met a more tender-hearted father than David on Twitter. And by golly, we need more kindness and tenderness in this world. So thank you, David, for being who you are and for the work you do. Over to you.
Goodness. That's so sweet. That's all so sweet. Yeah, the F word plus evidence. That's kind of my tagline. I was thinking about, what I want to say to a bunch of people who are just jumping in to the climate fight, to the climate area, to climate in general. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk just a little bit about how the climate fight has changed, how my job has changed, how the sort of climate environment, sort of cultural and political environment around climate change has changed over the years. And I'm just going to try to keep it relatively brief because I'd like to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So if you can cast your mind back to 2004, some of you probably weren't even born yet. In 2004 is when I started at Grist. I had no experience in anything, journalism or environmentalism or anything. So 2004, I jumped into Grist and basically jumped in to teach myself about all this stuff. And it's difficult to describe to people today what it was like in the mid 2000s trying to write about climate change for a living. For one thing, it's hilarious. I used to come into work and really worry about what I was going to write about, whether there would be something to write about, whether I could find something to write about, because Republicans were in charge and they weren't talking about it a lot, obviously, and there nothing was happening on it. And the problem itself, you can come in and write like the Earth is 0.0001 degrees warmer today. The seas rose another 0.0001 inches. It's there's not a lot of progress. There's not a lot of things to write about. And insofar as there was ever news to write about, it was generally another organization released a report confirming that we're all doomed. So, and there's a lot of reasons for that, political and otherwise, but one reason that the climate dialogue back then was basically environmentalists and scientists pounding the table about climate change coming to kill us all. No one really listening or engaging except this sort of core set of right-wing climate deniers. So for a decade, all people in my job thought about was, how can we argue with these? How can we have better arguments against these climate deniers? How can we convince the deniers? I really can't tell you how many hours of manpower and effort and thought went into that, ultimately futile undertaking. But it was just an abstract, it was abstract in the way that feed the poor is abstract, or just it was sort of a do-gooder thing that some people adopted as part of their identity and most people largely ignored. And why is that? Because when you got down to it, what should people do about it? There wasn't much to say because you needed to change everything. And the fossil fuel alternative sources of energy and technology were wildly expensive, just like 10 to 20x what they are now. So, the only real public policy answer to what to do about it is we've got to close that price differential, which means we need to make fossil fuels more expensive, right? So it was all about economists and it was all about carbon pricing. So, so that meant a couple of things. One is, if you were telling people how to get engaged, if I was, telling people like you how to get engaged, basically it's either become an activist, right? Go march on the street, go join everyone who's pounding the table yelling about it. Or if you want to do something in your personal life, recycle, change your light bulb. That's what I remember after Al Gore's movie in the credits. That's what audiences were encouraged to do. Go home and change your light bulb, which of course, a moment's thought will tell you is utterly ludicrous in the face of this problem, but there's not much else people could do. So this was the situation around climate change. It's a big, abstract, distant, scary, gloomy problem that we're asking you to sort of take on, and all that's to be done about, and if you believe it, and if you adopt it, and if you take it on board, you will support the sort of harsh medicine we all have to take, which is we all have to pay more, and we all have to pay more for all the things we do every day, and we all have to feel vaguely guilty about the things we do every day. Every time we turn on a light bulb or drive to the store or whatever, feel guilty, recycle, buy a reusable tote bag, because this giant gloomy problem is looming over us. It's just not, as a communications matter, it's just not pleasant. No one wants to take that on. No average person wants to sort of like darken their darken their worldview by several notches and feel more guilt and pay more. And, it's just dreary all around. And that's so, throughout the kind of mid 2000s and even the early 2010s, it was mostly just an abstraction that people thought about. You had, occasional waves of interest, like around 2000, 2007 and 8, when Al Gore's movie came out, and there was green was fashionable for a while. There was a Vanity Fair green issue. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that, a Vanity Fair green issue that my boss, Chip from Grist, was on the cover of, and somehow he and I were in a photo shoot in an article in the middle of it. It's just all bizarre. It was just like a cultural fad, and then it passed. So anyway, it was grim. And so, a lot has changed since then. I was going to sort of focus on three things that have changed since then. One is on politics. Back then, climate change was very much a thing environmentalists worried about, and it was more or less left to them, and no one else cared. So, so for years there's been activism and education efforts and lobbying and on, and it has, to a first approximation, worked. It finally seems like climate change has broken out of that ghetto and is now a top tier political issue in the US and around the world. It's not something that just environmentalists worry about anymore. And I think, if you want evidence for that, you can look at the last couple of years of the sort of Build Back Better fight. Democrats came out with their Build Back Better plan, which contained an entire giant Christmas tree of great policy. And, over the next year, it got whacked down and whacked down and whacked down, and things got taken out of it. There's all these fights and drama, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of all that, what survived, what staggered out of the wreckage, the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate and energy provisions from the original Build Back Better package survived that, more or less intact, more or less unmolested. And so that's, to me, was an object lesson, like of all the things Democrats wanted to do, what survived, all right, what made it to the finish line, it was climate, almost alone. So I think that's a real testament to the fact that political advocacy and all the marching and all the activism and all the sort of table pounding from this tiny faction of people on the left, has done the job of putting climate change on the mainstream political agenda. Secondly, there had been another thing that was very true when I first started, is that climate change was written about, covered, if at all, by a relatively tiny cabal of science journalists who wrote about it the way science journalists write about things, and nobody else paid much attention. And so since then, thousands and thousands of journalists and pundits and researchers, people like me, have been struggling to tell the story in different ways, struggling to break climate change out of that ghetto. And that also, and this has been sort of my central role and quest and goal for my whole career, is to try to sort of, I consider myself a political liberal, and to me, climate change is not some weird other separate issue alongside the issues I care about as a liberal. To me, climate change fits right in there. Like, climate change makes absolutely all the sense in the world as a thing for a liberal to be concerned about, because it's income inequality, it's the powerful taking advantage of the powerless, it's corporate greed, it's the need for more public spending, for tighter regulatory standards. Like, these are all things that liberals are concerned about in other parts of their life. So I spent a decade of my career sort of hounding kind of the other liberal and center left writers and pundits and journalists, just telling them over and over again, like, this is, if you care about that, then you care about this. If you care about income inequality, then you care about this. Like, if you're, whatever, if you care about housing and urban issues, you care about this. Like, this is not some exotic other thing. This should be at the core of your political worldview. And I sort of think that has also, to a first approximation, worked. Like, people are engaging now, people outside of the sort of science and environmental communities are engaging now in a more than cursory, a more than shallow way. They're struggling to actually work through the implications of climate change. It's even sort of leaking out into popular culture now. It's moved finally out of the science and environmental sort of niche and become something that sort of mainstream political pundits and thinkers, and even sort of like celebrities and tastemakers and influencers, or whatever the hell you call them, like it's slowly but surely leaking out into the wider world, and people are processing it and working it into their worldviews, which is something, I've been trying to do for ages. So it's quite gratifying to see that. And then the third thing that's changed, which I think is the most important, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want, is there has been going on in the background, grinding along, a mutually reinforcing cycle of supportive policy and technology development. And, we can talk about this in the Q&A too. And I just want to emphasize here that those two things are not separate. Those are part of a single phenomenon, the sort of cycle of policy and tech development that both feed into one another. And so there's been supportive policy, and this is something I sort of missed early in my career. I figure as I look back now in the 2000s and early 2010s, is I was, my eyes were on the federal government and I was frustrated because nothing was happening. But I sort of missed that in the States, even starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, there were state advocates, working and passing these like renewable portfolio standards at the state level, basically forcing utilities and states to ramp up the amount of clean power they used. That kind of policy was not in vogue in mainstream climate sort of policy circles. Everybody, like I said, was obsessed with economists and obsessed with carbon pricing and sort of disdained the use of these command and control standards, forcing people to do stuff. But in retrospect, like, forcing deployment is what brought prices down. So that's supportive policy in the US. Supportive policy in Germany early on was a crucial piece of it, and supportive policy in China was a huge, huge piece of it. China just dumped, did its usual brute force, dumped billions and billions and billions of dollars on this. And so the result of this mutually reinforcing cycle is that the basic building blocks of a clean energy economy have radically come down in price. They're cheap. They're cheap now. The big building blocks are cheap now. And what's more, we've done a lot of research, a lot of testing and prototyping, a lot of pilot projects, and we've sort of gotten a sense now of what works and what doesn't, what's going to get cheaper and cheaper and what isn't. So how sort of direct our attention and focus. And so now you've got the clean energy technologies got this momentum of its own that has largely broken free. It's no longer tailing along behind the climate change, the case for climate change and the case for climate action. It has largely gained a momentum separate from that, that would continue at this point, regardless of climate change. We can talk about that later too. So these are the sort of three things that have changed. The sort of politics have changed, the kind of storytelling and public conception has changed, and most of all, the stuff we need to do to solve it has gotten very cheap. So those three things in concert have completely transformed this conversation from when I first got involved in it. And it's, it's one of these things where change is kind of sped up and sped up and sped up. So even in the last 5 years, even in the last 2 years, the conversation has completely changed in a bunch of ways. First, the whole question of, is this real and do we need to do something about it? Finally, blessedly, we're not talking about it anymore. No one that I know is still losing sleep over how to convince climate deniers, this kind of stuff. Like, that stuff is in the past. Every country in the world is engaged in this fight. Almost every large institution in every country in the world is engaged some way or another in this fight. Everybody, even if there are people left who are skeptical about the science, doesn't really matter anymore. Everybody's moving, so everybody else has to move. Like, this is the argument about whether to move is over. All the arguments remaining are about speed and cost and distribution, who pays, who benefits, who gets hurt, that kind of thing. So, the entire conversation is now about how to do this, not whether to do this. It's about, how to avert the terrible danger, not whether the danger is terrible. And I really can't tell you how freeing that is and how utterly tedious that discussion was, how long it lasted and how fruitless it was. And anyway, I'm very glad that's over. Second, because of all this technology development and policy development, the question of what to do about it has come into much greater focus. Like for the first many, many years I was writing about this and talking about this, the question of how to solve it was just, hard to answer beyond the sort of carbon pricing thing, like make carbon more expensive and then magic will happen elsewhere in the economy. And then, something problem solved. It was very difficult to tell a story about how it's solved. And it's very difficult to tell individual people how to get engaged in solving it because it just wasn't clear what to do. And so the question of what to do, how to solve it, is now much more in focus and has much more clarity and much more detail. We can talk about that too in the Q&A if you want. Thirdly, in terms of storytelling, and this, I touch on this because it's sort of my job, my role. To me, climate change, the problem, has somewhat receded to the background where I think it belongs. This is somewhat controversial. We can talk about this later if you want, but I think it belongs in the background. I think the foreground, I rarely write about climate change as such, or do podcasts about it as such anymore. To me, it's the background. The foreground now is the global quest to build a new world, to build a non-fossil fuel world. That is the story to me. Climate change is a background motivator to that story. It's a context to that story, the context that shapes everything about it, shapes the direction it has to take. But the foreground, the main story, is this upwelling of global effort and ingenuity and passion in building an entirely new world. And it really is, we really do have to kind of replace or revise or change everything. And that's, to me, like, it's been a long time since I've come into work and worried I would have anything to write about, right? Like it's happening now. This foreground, the fight is joined all across the board. And so there's just so much story to tell, so much to track, so much happening. This is impossible to exaggerate the contrast between this and like 2005. Like in 2005, climate change was just an abstraction. Nothing was really happening except very slow incremental heating of the earth. Nothing was happening. And now things are happening across the board at every level of government, in every large institution, in private capital and NGOs, just on and on and on. And if anybody who listens to my podcast, I hope if they take anything away is just, wow, there are a lot of clever people out there in the world thinking of very clever solutions to very specific subsets of this problem, right? It's no longer like change your light bulb. Like there's a million ways, a million things people are doing. And so from like a journalism storyteller perspective, it's just these are salad days. Like there's more to tell, more happening than anyone could possibly cover or track. So trying to wrapping up here, if I had given you, if I had given a talk to a group like this in, say, 2005, I would have pounded the table about how bad climate change is and how bad it's going to get, pounded and pounded until I was sure you were full of dread and anxiety. And then you would have said, but what do we do? And I would have said, well, become an activist. That was pretty much it. Like, go pick up a cardboard sign and go march. Like, go pound on the door of your legislator's office. Like, that's it. Like, what can we do in our personal lives? The light bulbs. Like, change your light bulbs, get your tote bags. Then what? Like, I wouldn't have had much to say to you. And that's just like, I was in that situation many times, and I always felt bad. I'm like, let me fill you with dread and anxiety, and then give you, almost no way out of it. Just sit with it. You're welcome. But now, with a group like this, I can say, honestly, like, there are a billion ways for you to enter this fight beyond your friggin' light bulbs. Like, we need innovators and engineers developing technologies. We need, if you work in a bank, you can get involved in trying to channel financing away from fossil fuels to clean energy. We need architects and designers. We need community activists to help communities become more resilient, to install distributed energy and increase resilience against weather events. We need, we need local political leaders who are into this, and we need people who are, building bike lanes and working for density and fighting NIMBYs in the cities so we can make cities more sustainable. We need, international aid and development. We need people who are conversant in that. We need people who can sell distributed energy to, places in the world where they have no power, on and on and on. We need artists and storytellers to tell the story of this new world that's being built, to tell the story of this grand, global, generational fight that is being joined, this grand effort. We're all joining together. Tell those stories, because certain hardcore liberals I've discovered over the course of my career tend to love and treasure their dread and their pessimism and don't like giving it away. But ordinary people, are energized by the idea that this fight is joined and there are victories and is winning, and we're doing it together. Like, we're doing it together and we're winning and we're making progress. Those stories need to be told. So that's, that's for journalists and storytellers and YouTube makers and TikTokers, whatever the hell the kids do these days. I'll just tell those stories where people live so people hear them. So point being, no matter what you do, no matter your skill set and interests and passions, no matter where you are, you have your hands on a little piece of this fight, and you can join it. You don't have to pick up a cardboard sign and march down the street. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's still great. Activism is still great. Still, please become an activist. But like, there are so many routes into this fight now, and there are so many people involved in it. So there's thrills to be had. There's solidarity to be had. There's excitement and forward-looking progress to be had now in a way that just was not true for so long in my career. So all of which is just to say that you guys are jumping into this. You couldn't pick a better time. Like, this is the fight, and so much is happening, and it's a thrill to welcome you to it. So I'm going to shut up now and take some questions. Am I supposed to do something about taking questions?
Can you hear me?
There you
Yes.
are.
Okay, sorry, I think my sound was off for a moment. Yeah, I'll handle some questions. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. It's right in line with what we talk about all the time. There's a role for everyone in the climate fight today. We also often, some of us like to say there is no silver bullet to address climate change, but there might be a lot of silver buckshot, and you just have to find your piece of that you want to get behind. So thanks again. And fellows, please remember, you can ask questions using the link in Slido. I'm going to start, David, with asking you one question, and it's not about jobs, but you mentioned that this issue really is in line with liberal priorities, and you've been trying to convince people forever that if you care about justice, you should care about this. And the question is, do you think it's possible to address climate change without addressing the justice issues? And if so, is that something we ought to be concerned about, as those of us who care about that?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, not to be Debbie Downer, but it's not only possible. I would, based on history, I'd say the safe betting money is on us trying to do it like that. Like that's tends to be how we do things. If you look at history, like it's there are a million ways to cut CO2 emissions on the backs of people who have suffered from CO2 emissions in the past. There are a million ways to spread the benefits of a clean economy in a highly unjust and skewed way, so that a couple of big monopolies capture a lot of the value. Like all the normal justice and economic problems in our economy that we're all familiar with, all of those apply to climate change. All of those are going to shape climate change. Solving climate change is not some separate thing that we're going to do in some different special way than we do everything else. We're probably going to do it the way we do other things. So all of which is to say, like, if we want to do it in a way that remedies injustices of the past and remedies some of the current injustices, that will have to be a fight. That will be a fight every step of the way. That will require people being in the face of policymakers and the people working on this, never letting them forget it. It's not gonna happen automatically. Although one thing I will say, and I always want to reinforce this, the environmental justice community has a lot of sort of its demands and its principles and all this, and I don't want to speak for them or in any way dismiss any of that, but it's worth saying that the flip side of the coin, right now, vulnerable frontline communities suffer disproportionately, both from air pollution and climate pollution, both from normal air pollution and from the effects of climate change. But the flip side of that coin is anything that reduces pollution or climate pollution disproportionately benefits frontline communities. So in a sense, the fight against climate change, the fight against fossil fuels is intrinsically an environmental justice fight. It is intrinsically a fight for justice, because insofar as you replace polluting sources and technologies with clean ones, you are going to disproportionately benefit the frontline communities that were suffering from them. So that's not enough. You need to do a lot more than that to do justice to these communities and remedy past sins. But just flat out reducing pollution, full stop, is an environmental justice policy. It does serve justice.
Thanks for that. And to add to that, I listened to your fabulous podcast with David Wallace Wells, and he talked.
Greg is in rural Wyoming, so he's facing the classic rural internet issues that Biden is supposed to fix.
I apologize. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, so sorry. My internet is being, I don't know, it's riding out on the range across the Wind River Mountains here. I was just going to say, to follow up on that, I listened to your fabulous podcast with David Wallace Wells, and he suggested that we shouldn't necessarily talk about addressing climate change, but we should focus on the immediate problem of air pollution, because addressing pollution also addresses climate change. Should our messaging focus more on the immediate impacts, like air pollution kills 10 million people a year across the world, and that's immediate?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm torn about messaging. I'm always torn about messaging. I don't know what works. I don't know what works with messaging, but it is peculiar to me though. But like air pollution, the more we find out about it, the more horrible we realize it is, even as much as we've reduced it in the US. It's just, there is, what we're finding through the science is there is no safe level of like particulate pollution. Any of it hurts people, brains, babies, fetuses, kids, cognitive development, heart disease. Like pick a health problem or a social problem, and air pollution plays a role in it. So reducing, you know, the if you quantified and put a number, a dollar number on the health benefits of reducing pollution, that alone would more than pay for the transition to clean energy. This is something I emphasize over and over again. Take climate change out of the picture entirely. Switching to clean energy from what we use now would save so many lives through air pollution that it would pay for the transition tenfold. You don't even need to invoke climate change. So this is what I mean about sort of like things spilling beyond the climate change bucket. Like transitioning to clean energy makes economic sense. It makes national security sense. It makes justice sense. It makes public health sense. All of that is true independently of climate change. Like climate change is just one argument among many now for the clean energy transition. All those other arguments for the clean energy transition are now strong enough to stand on their own.
Thank you. Question from Slido. What types of technologies do you think need new supportive government policy to further their development?
Well, all of them. There are certain technologies now, like I said, the core building blocks now have sort of, to use a metaphor, they've sort of crested the mountain and are rolling downhill now. So supporting them like solar and wind, you're not pushing a rock up a hill anymore. They're cheap now and getting cheaper. The rock is rolling down the hill, but there are tight time constraints. So we need it to roll faster. So all of them need supportive policy. And I would actually, once again, being in the weird position of being kind of a cheerleader for what the US government has done. But if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it actually spreads its tax incentives in a very smart and rational way. Like the wind and solar are still supported, and batteries, which are also on learning curves and getting cheaper and cheaper. But it also, to the point of like what technologies are still kind of short of commercialization, it's hydrogen and advanced geothermal and advanced nuclear and carbon capture and reuse and burial and all those technologies. So all those technologies get some money in IRA, in the Inflation Reduction Act. We'd actually spread those out very cheaply. To me, what we tend to overlook is not individual technologies, which we tend to be really good at. Like for all our incompetence in handling the climate problem, like we know how to take a technology and make it cheap. We've done it before. We did it with solar. Like the story of solar is very well told, solar PV. We made that cheap on purpose. And we know how to do that with other technologies. And this is what IRA is doing, is precisely what makes technologies cheap, was you're supporting them through the sort of, lab, test, first in class demonstration project, market, mass market. Like we know the basic technology curve, and we're targeting support at technologies that are at various points along that curve. Which is smart. So I think like technology wise, we're doing pretty well. What's more difficult is what you might call like social technology. I don't even know exactly what to call it, but like, how to densify and make cities more walkable, right? That doesn't require any new widgets. Nobody needs to invent any new widgets to do that. It's not a technological problem in that sense, but we badly need to get better at rapidly doing that, building those things, building the bike lanes, right? Up zoning, getting rid of parking, like, or to take it out of cities, one of the big bottlenecks in the next sort of phase of spread of clean energies is NIMBYs, out in the country who don't want solar fields or wind farms or whatever. There are NIMBYs everywhere along this process. Everything we need to do, there's some core of NIMBYs in the way. So what is the kind of social technology, if you want to think of it that way, that overcomes community resistance? What does that look like? Like, we need to figure out what works and how to replicate what works. So that's not really a technology problem. That's a social practices and political problem, which very often are more difficult, right? You can't just put a bunch of engineers on it. They're very often more difficult to solve than technology problems. And those, to me, are the next big bottlenecks, is trying to figure out how to change human behavior quickly, which is the kind of the ultimate riddle.
Thanks, David. And John Denny asks a question. They got a number of so he asks, it would be great to hear what you think about carbon credits, especially in terms of the voluntary carbon market and where you see that going in the next 5 years.
I don't know where it'll go. It'll probably just keep on chugging along in the background, more or less irrelevantly. I've sort of been convinced over time. I used to think that carbon offsets at least made a kind of logical sense, but it's like many things that I've changed my mind on, which is, I used to think, like, if you could do it in this tight, well-regulated, well-monitored way, it could work. But, if your solutions require a political economy that you're not able to produce, then your solutions are not great. Like, all the incentives for all the participants in those markets weigh against tight oversight and tight rules and high standards, right? Nobody actually involved in those markets wants high standards. They all want, like, the buyers, the sellers, the regulators, everybody involved in those undertakings wants cheap offsets. In a sense, that's sort of the whole political economy motivator for creating offsets in the first place, is people want cheap credits. And you get what you pay for. Like, if you want to do real good, if you want to make a real difference, you pay more. You'll pay more for, and there are high quality sort of credits. There are high quality offsets out there available. You can buy offsets that ensure additionality. You can, there's lots of ways to spend your money where you can do real good. But the sort of bulk, cheap, voluntary carbon offset market is like, it's fine, but it's not a big player. It's not doing much good. Like, if it makes you feel a little better to pay like $4 extra on your plane flight to offset your plane flight, go ahead and do it. It's going to do a micron of good, but let's be under no illusions. Like, it's not going to drive any big change.
Yeah, thanks. And to the fellows, we go into this fair bit in the course, and Kamal does an excellent deep dive on carbon offsets that I encourage everyone to attend. Another question from Slido here. In your opinion, David, what role and impact can individuals, consumers have in the climate fight from a behavior change aspect versus government policy corporations?
Oh, that's a thicket of a question. I would say one of the things that's changed, to return to my theme, is that back then, as an individual consumer, your options were very limited and your impact was very limited. But now, like, I think the right way to, let me back up, like, everybody, the grid is getting smarter, and people are doing more behind the meter in their houses and buildings to generate energy, to store energy, to manage energy. So every smart building and smart appliance and EV is a potential grid asset, is a resource available to the grid, which means basically it's infrastructure. We're used to thinking of infrastructure as big, distant, huge projects funded in the billions, this kind of thing. But we need to rethink that. Like, for the modern grid, every building and car and every user of energy is a potential grid asset that could be communicating with the grid and helping the grid with stability, et cetera, et cetera. So all of which is to say, every individual who owns a building, a home, or a building, or a car, owns some infrastructure, has some infrastructure. So as an individual, you can get rid of gas in your home, right? Step one, you can buy a heat pump to replace your furnace. Get rid of that evil, stupid gas stove and replace it with an induction cooktop. Get rid of your fossil fueled car, replace it with an EV. Buy some sort of smart circuit breaker or circuit box that allows your loads to be managed and moved around, that allows your home to communicate with the grid. And then you are an effective piece of infrastructure. That's still, relatively speaking, a small impact, but it's a lot more than changing your light bulbs, right? It's you actually have a decent chunk now of your greenhouse gases in your direct control. Obviously, this is all, we can get into renters and landlords and that whole difficult set of issues. But so individual consumers can do quite a bit now. But another thing I want to say about that is, the problem back in 2005 was either you're getting involved in activism about big, distant federal government policy, or you're doing basically trivial things in your personal life. And then all this, there wasn't a lot in between. But now, all that space in between, there's tons of stuff that's more than personal consumer decisions, but less than, lobbying your senator. Like, get involved in your neighborhood. Like, there are neighborhood HOA type issues, like lots of HOAs ban solar panels. Get involved in your neighborhood. Get involved in your city and try to support densification and support the building of apartments and support upzoning and support bike lanes and support multimodal transportation and bus systems. Get involved in community groups. Get involved in city government. There's just all these levels now that are closer than the federal government, which feels very distant, but more than just atomic US consumer, right? You're more than that. You are an engaged member of a variety of communities, and all those communities can do something in this fight. So just don't forget that sort of middle layer of community engagement that's between the individual and government, faraway governments. There are lots of more proximate, smaller, more intimate communities you're involved in, all of which you can affect.
Thank you. We've got another question that we want to make sure we get to, which is, what technology or innovation or policy are you most excited, optimistic about? And I'm going to add to that with, and what is needed to make those really help us in the climate fight?
Well, this will be a geeky answer. There's sort of two technologies that I'm super geeked out about right now. One is advanced geothermal. Anybody who listens to my pod will know why. So, geothermal power is just takes heat from under the surface of the earth to run a turbine and create electricity. The deeper you go, the hotter it is, the cheaper it is to create the electricity. And previously, people thought of geothermal as kind of a baseload resource. It's something that's always running, like nuclear is a baseload resource. You don't want to be ramping your nuclear plant up and down, to follow load. It's cheapest and makes most sense just to run it constantly, or a coal plant. People thought of geothermal like that. And the problem is that like always on baseload resources don't fit very well into the modern electricity grid or modern electricity markets, because modern electricity markets have a lot of variable renewable energy in them that's doing this all the time. So what you badly need in modern grids is flexible, fast resources that can ramp up and down to compensate for the variations in renewable energy. You need fast, flexible resources. But what they've discovered now, or not discovered, but sort of realized, is that you can actually use geothermal that way. You can ramp it up and down. You can use it just by you're still pumping the pressure down, but if you cap what's coming out, the pressure builds up down there, which is basically energy storage. And then you can release the output when you want to follow loads, which means advanced geothermal could be long-term energy storage, which we desperately need, and a fast, flexible, load-following resource on the grid, which we also desperately need, carbon-free, available everywhere. Like if we get down deep enough, if we figure out how to go very deep, that deep geothermal is available literally everywhere in the world. So massive energy storage, fast, flexible, clean, firm power available everywhere is a very big deal. It's nascent now, right? They're just doing like demonstration projects. And what would help that along? Money and policy support, just like everything else. Supportive markets, supportive procurement policies, et cetera, et cetera. That's one. The other one is thermal storage. There's been a lot of vexation about energy storage lately, about how to store energy for a long time, how to store energy cheaply. Batteries solve a lot of problems, but they don't really solve the sort of big scale, long-term energy storage problem. It turns out you can store energy as heat instead in a whole wide variety of ways. Like there's this one company that just basically has made a big rock, a big square cube of graphite, basically, and they take excess energy that you want to store, just heat the rock up. And then when you want the energy back, they let it out of the rock. It's just like, this is what I mean. Like there's so many tech developments happening now that are kind of low-hanging fruit, just because we never thought very much about how to do this stuff. So they can get this graphite so hot that it's glowing, that the light, that the energy comes out of it as light. So they surround it with shutters, and they can open the shutters different increments, let different amounts of light out, and the light comes and strikes these special solar PV panels, and that's how you get energy out of the rock. It's just so clever. There's a million sort of clever thermal storage ideas bouncing around now, which I'm very excited about. And they, and it's the same with them. It's just support getting over the hump into the market and commercializing. So those are kind of the two techs I'm geeked out about. And of course, saying here again, my number one is livable, walkable, multimodal urban density, which is not a technology per se, I guess, but is probably my number one obsession these days.
Thank you. And thank you for ending with, just city design and livable cities and world. That's such an important thing. Well, David Roberts, it's been an hour. I don't want to keep you too long. Thank you so much. There are a number of fabulous questions people still want to ask. And folks, if you want more of this fabulous information, subscribe to David's newsletter at volts.wtf. I've been a subscriber since he started it, and it's fantastic. I learn so much from David every week. So thank you again, David. Thank you, fellows. Sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. Really appreciate you all, and have a great day. We will share this recording later in the day. Take care, everyone.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, David.
So much.
Bye.
See you on Twitter.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.